Good evening and welcome to 6 News. I'm Stephanie Bryan. If someone asks you what today's date is, you might say, well, it's Monday. That's not wrong. They may also say it's June 19th. That too is correct. Or you might recognize that today commemorates Juneteenth, which brings us to our first story. 6 News' Rose Claire is in the studio to tell us all about it. Rose.
That's right, Stephanie. Today is Juneteenth, the day commemorating freedom from slavery in the United States. But it came more than 2 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And the curator of the Watkins Museum of History told me all about Lawrence's place in this historical day. Watkins Museum of History curator Brittany Keegan says even more than a century ago, Lawrence had one quality that remains to this day.
Lawrence was more welcoming than a lot of the other places. Populations, both white and African American, in Lawrence went out of their way to help people.
Which brings us to this day in history, more than a century and a half ago, on June 19th, 1865, or as we now know it, Juneteenth.
Juneteenth is the celebration and commemoration of the word spreading about the end of slavery.
In other words, slaves were meant to be freed more than 2 years earlier, when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. But many slaves were never told. June 19, 1865 marks the date 2 years later that they received word.
I believe it officially commemorates when the news reached Galveston, Texas, which is as far south as the United States kind of went at that point.
Though the exact date may not be precisely correct.
I think it's between the 16th and the 19th, or the 13th and the 19th. So because there's not a precise day, it got called Juneteenth.
But Keegan says here in Lawrence, there were few slaves left by that time. In fact, once Kansas became a free state in 1861, many slaves were fleeing to Lawrence via underground railroads. Like Rebecca Brooks Harvey, her family escaped to the area right around the Juneteenth time period. And by the end of the century, her children were attending KU and would become doctors and lawyers, which seems fitting for the town of Lawrence.
It's a community that puts education at the forefront. It's a community that is welcoming of individuals of a wide range of backgrounds, and I think you see that quite a bit today as well.
And though Lawrence had fairly open freedoms through the end of the 1800s, I'm told that unfortunately around the turn of the 20th century, the town was not free of prejudice around the time of segregation laws. For 6 News, I'm Rose Claire. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Rose. In the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 specifically freed slaves in the Confederate-controlled areas. Museum curator Brittany Keegan says it took until the 14th Amendment to officially grant citizenship to African-American men. That was ratified in 1868. Folks in Lawrence can check out this exhibit at the Watkins Museum of History until mid-July.